Welcome to our podcast, Nothing is Black and White. This is our first podcast, so we hope you guys will enjoy it. This is Lucas speaking.
This is Tim.
And today we'll be talking about whether white privilege exists or not. So the question is there such thing as white privilege? Are you ready, Tim?
Let's do it.
So is there such thing as white privilege? Tim, I'm gonna let you go first.
So we're just gonna do a yes or no answer to this.
Cool, why not, man?
Okay. So obviously I'm gonna answer this in the context of the 21st century, in the time zone that we live in now, and just so everyone knows, it's 2022. In 2022, is there white privilege? No, I don't think so. And we can get into that in many different layers, but let's hear what you got to say, Lucas, and then we can see where we stand.
Okay, so I'm going to spice it up a bit. My answer to the proposition or the question is yes, there is such thing as white privilege. But before I go into the details, I'm going to give you the opportunity to elaborate. So explain what. So what makes you say that there is no such thing? So you're saying that white privilege doesn't exist. Am I correct?
In 2022, yeah.
As opposed to what, last year?
As opposed to like 100 years ago.
Okay, so then one day it just ceased to exist.
No, so basically, let me get into it, because obviously I can only speak based on my own life experiences, and I will say that in my life, what I've experienced is that I haven't had any privileges afforded to me because of the color of my skin. Now we can go into, and my position is going to be a lot more culturally on this position, because I think capitalism, the capitalist societies that we live in, especially in America, England, etc. England could be a little bit of a different animal than America, but in America, you basically, there is no systemic legislation, there is no government intervention to ensure that white people or any other race is privileged against anyone else. And so I think that there's some cultural aspects between races that have produced success economically compared to others. And I think that's what a lot of people use as their measure of success, right? Is how much money or financial well-being you have compared to others. And that's based on, in a capitalist society, obviously, the more value you provide to society, the more you're rewarded. And so going off that premise, there are discrepancies between different races. I don't think that's because of skin color or any systemic privileges afforded to one race or another. I think that's based on cultural habits and value structures that produce those kind of discrepancies in wealth and well-being.
So to encapsulate, are you saying that you believe that some races have superior cultural habits than others? Correct me if I'm mistaken. I mean, I'm not trying to put any words in your mouth. I'm just trying to interpret exactly what you're saying.
So that's actually a really good question, because basically I don't think any cultural value or anything else is superior to another. But given that we live in a capitalist society, there are values that are rewarded above others. And that is under a capitalist framework, that there is a value structure there, and some habits and values are rewarded more so than others. And sometimes those value structures don't line up with the specific cultural or racial value structure. Now, that being said, we're obviously overgeneralizing here as well, because there can be someone, if we're just strictly going off skin color, there's that a white person can have many different cultures and many different values and things like that. So obviously when we talk about white privilege, which is kind of like an overgeneralized kind of expression as it is, it does span a lot of different cultures. And in general, I think when people look at England or America specifically, there are certain races in general who have higher incomes on average, higher educational levels on average, things like that. And yeah, so I think that there is no value structure that's more superior than another. But I do think in the capitalist framework, there are values that are valued higher than others. And part of that's discipline, hard work, education. Um, yeah, things like
So
that.
your proposition seems limited to a capitalistic structure, right? So this only pertains to a nation that you say is relatively capitalistic, right?
That's true. So, and when I use, I'm using capitalism as the framework for the backdrop of privilege, because almost every country has some kind of capitalist structure. I mean, you're sitting with China in your background, and even though they have a communist government structure, they definitely have a capitalist economic structure. And when I say capitalist, I mean, if you provide value to society, you get rewarded financially due to that, and that's capitalism, you know. And so based on that, most countries have a capitalist structure, and thus most populations fall under a capitalist structure. So that's kind of the axiom, as we can say, that I'm using to describe where there would be privilege, where there could be discrepancies between races. So for example, yeah, okay, go ahead.
Go ahead, I'm listening.
No, I was going to say, so for example, if we just wanted to use like the art world or something, you know what I mean? Regardless of everything else, you might produce different races being more well off or more prevalent than others. And then you can kind of try and ascribe that to some kind of privilege. But my argument is going to be that's not the case. It's from cultural, habitual, and value differences among the cultures that will produce different discrepancies with whatever framework we're using. I'm happening to use capitalism, capitalist society, so through economic wealth as a measure for whether there could be privilege or not among white people.
Okay, so the first thing that I want to do with you is define privilege. So if we come to an agreement on what we believe privilege to be, then I guess we can move on to the next stage as to whether people have what we could define as a white privilege, right? So let me know if you disagree with me. So privilege is something that someone is born with. So it gives that individual a competitive edge in society in relativity to another person without that competitive edge. So would you agree that that is how you would define a privilege?
Yeah, I think privilege ultimately means that you have more opportunities afforded to you than relative to other people.
So let's keep it simple. So rather than like pluralize it with opportunities, let's say an opportunity, right? So let's give a simple example. Do you believe that someone who is born 6'1" has a privilege in relativity to someone who is born and grows to 5'10" as a male, let's say growing up in England, the UK? Do you think that would be a privilege?
No, not necessarily. I think it would be an attribute rather than a privilege. So I would see privilege more as if for some reason in this society, or just we'll make up a fictional society, if you're 6'1", if you're 6'1", you can participate in politics or you can participate in something else. If not, then you can't. That's a privilege privilege, that's, yeah, that would be different. So, but for someone who's born 6'1" or 5'11", I don't think there's I wouldn't use the word privilege for the person who's 6'1".
Okay, so let's give another example. So let's say
Mm-hmm.
two individuals the same age are born, and one person is born under the tutelage of one parent, as opposed to
Mm-hmm.
another person born under the tutelage of two parents. Would you say that one is privileged?
No. No, so I think they're going to have different. I mean, there's going to be benefits, obviously, to the child born with two parents for a whole host of reasons, and that's kind of backed by studies and things like that. But I wouldn't kind of describe that as a privilege. So I guess I'll give you. I guess this is going to be kind of like the stereotypical example that everyone would be thinking about is if um, as say you're some, and this is probably where people will think about with white privilege or whatever. If that I'm born in America, for example, and I'm born to a bunch of money, and then I go to private schools, which then allow me to go to better universities, which allow me to make more money throughout my life. And then when you take a snapshot at society, you see, oh, this white person uh, has a bunch of money or whatever, a lot of economic well-being, thus a lot of opportunity. And so someone might interpret that as a privilege. But yeah,
Okay.
but so in fact, let me kind of draw that out a little bit more.
Mhm.
And then I think where people would think about maybe white privilege is that if me being white, I'm allowed to go to certain schools over other people. I'm allowed to get into certain jobs over people. I'm allowed basic opportunities over other people. I think that's what people would interpret as privilege, and white privilege, especially in the context of America and England.
Okay, okay. Can you give me an example in which you believe one person might be born with a privilege as opposed to another?
Yeah, so I mean, we can go back to, um, you know, the 20s in America or something, and you can see certain groups privileged left and right over others. And we're talking about men over women. You know, a lot of men were educated back in those days and women weren't. So that was a privilege men got to have. And then if we want to go take it to a racial aspect, I mean, the obvious one is that until the 60s, African Americans weren't treated equally in America. So they couldn't go to the same schools, they couldn't ride the same buses. They simply weren't afforded, they couldn't get access to financing, all sorts of things that all sorts of privileges that were afforded to people of certain specific race, and that was ingrained in legislation and in the government apparatus at the time. So I think that is the most obvious.
Okay, so those seem a bit more
Yeah,
palpable, right? But
yeah,
let's stick to the 21st century. Don't you believe that
you got it.
some people are born with privileges within one given nation? So even using England or the United States as an example, do you
Mhm.
believe that two people can be born? Let's presuppose that they both um, are naturalized into that country, into the given country.
Mhm.
Do you believe that
Yeah.
it's possible for one person to be privileged?
Yeah, so here we go. We'll kind of get to the meat of it now, because where I really think there's privilege in the 21st century is socioeconomically. So I think based on your economic situation being brought into the world, that affords you certain privileges against other people who are not well off economically. They have a lot more limited opportunity afforded to them because of their economic situation. So that's where I think privilege really exists in the 21st century. Um, but we can kind of, but obviously the question is, does white privilege exist? And I think when we start to get into the racial lines of privilege, it's not really there. You can see within certain races based on their value structures that they've done well economically because of that. Jews, Asians, um, even Indians, people, and I'm kind of using this as a reference in America, they've done well through discipline, through valuing education, through hard work, um, pursuing STEM subjects, things like that. And those are what's needed in society. And so they get rewarded accordingly, and they become more economically well off. And then certain privileges are then afforded to them. And then I think some people will wrongly ascribe that to the color of their skin and not their value structures or their cultural prerogatives, things like that.
Okay, so it seems as though your argument is predicated on socioeconomics, right? So
that's where I think privilege is most prolific in the 21st century.
Okay, so let's talk about discrimination. Do you believe that one person is more likely to be discriminated against than the other?
Well, yeah, I mean, discrimination happens. It's part of human nature.
Sure, sure,
but
do you believe? Let's go slowly. Do you believe that it's possible?
Okay. Absolutely.
Right. Okay. So if you believe it's possible, do you think that somebody being more inclined to discrimination or to be subjected to discrimination might disadvantage that individual in pursuit for success?
So that's a very interesting question, because I kind of pondered this a little bit myself in terms of, because that's the other side of the coin, right? So I was going to say that in my life, so I'm going to keep it racial because that's what the question entails. But
Okay.
I grew up in Alaska, obviously, and there's not a lot of African Americans at my school, and I think they were discriminated against, maybe picked on, or there was this kind of edge. And I think there was a human nature aspect that if someone looks or appears different, then they're targeted. Whether that's a human nature thing or not, I guess we could debate that. So I think there is discrimination. Now, do I think that discrimination impacts their opportunities in life and their privileges? I'm not sure, because sometimes I think those opportunities of adversity that they face could actually build them up and allow them to be more successful than someone who perhaps had a lot less adversity growing up in a certain school. And on the flip side of that, just to kind of break down the racial argument, that I think if I went to a school in a predominantly African American school, I think I would be targeted just the same. I think it applies both ways. And I think a lot of this white privilege is contextualized in America, given that that's kind of the ground zero for these type of movements and things like that. There's a lot less, African Americans are a significant minority, and so thus, based on that human nature dynamic, probably are discriminated a bit more than other races.
Okay, so you say,
but does that afford them less privileges? That's a different question.
Okay, so you do concede to the idea that one person is more likely to be discriminated against than the other, right? But
yes.
So even you use the word a bit, right? So that works in relativity as well. So how much is a bit, right? And I guess we could be here all day trying to quantify that, right? But it still doesn't defeat the idea that discrimination still exists.
No, that's fine. I think discrimination does exist.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you to the extent that I don't believe that because someone might be discriminated against, that's a pretext for, let's say, less success in life, right?
Yeah.
But I just don't believe with the idea that somebody isn't born with privileges in comparison to another person. There are obvious privileges that I have that you might not necessarily have in society, right? And I do believe there are obvious privileges that you have, but what we seem to disagree with is the idea of what a privilege is, right? So maybe the best way to do this is to give clear-cut examples, right? So I'm going to start. So I'm going to talk about, so I actually tried to write a list of the privileges that Black people have in society, right? And didn't take me long. I mean, I swear to God, I only came up with about one or two. So I'll give an easy one, right? So one privilege that Black people have is they can say the word nigger in public without making most of the people in the room feeling as disconcerted as people would feel if a white person were to say that in public. So that's an example of just one small Picayune privilege that a Black person might have.
Okay.
Would you agree?
Yeah, I think, yeah, sure. I think, obviously if I were to say that, it would get a very different response, and rightly so, maybe.
Okay, so I mean, even whether people define that as a privilege or not, I guess is open to debate as well. But in turn, I actually wrote a list of privileges that white people have, or that I believe white people have. So I've not shared this with Tim prior to the podcast, so this will be the first time he's hearing this. But I actually want to hear whether you agree or not, because I think that some of them might just be from my perspective. So I'm going to go through the list and then let me know what you think. So the first one says, white people. So quick disclaimer, I'm going to use by and large for all of these. I don't think any of these are absolute. But I would say and another disclaimer is that I think that most, if not all of these privileges pertain only to white people in Western society, right? Which says a lot, I think. Okay, so the first one, white people by and large don't have to worry about being discriminated against in the workplace for their ethnic background. So this is presupposing that what do they call it? Affirmative action isn't existent within any given company, right? So what do you think to that?
I think that if you are a minority, you will be targeted some way, whether it's whether it's actually materialized and people are actually saying something and bullying and things like that is another thing to be said. But I think if you are in a minority, no matter what color of your skin, so if I'm in an all Asian company and it's just me there, then there will be some sort of discrimination, given the fact that I'm different to everyone else. I think that exists. Yeah. So I agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you raise a good point there as well, right? So it depends on what environment you're in. If you're living in a Western country, you're more likely to be predominated by ethnically white European people, right?
Exactly.
So the likelihood that the owners or the upper management resonates with white people more is higher, right? So I think you raise a good point there. And even if we instantiate a white European person living in India, then there's a pretty high chance it'd be discriminated against as well in comparison to the ethnic minority living in a Western country predominated by white people, like white. Okay, interesting. So the next one I had was okay, so again, I think a lot of these pertain to just European culture, right? White people, by and large, will never be as discommoded by racial epithets hurled in their direction by a complete stranger in any part of the world.
You're gonna have to translate those big words for me. The epithet.
Okay, white people by and large will never be as discommoded, meaning made disconcerted by racial epithets. So someone hurling some insult at you that is attributable to
oh,
you, that is in a background.
okay.
Right?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. So someone says like calls me a honky on the street,
Yeah,
basically.
exactly.
Like it's not going to bother me that much.
Huh?
So basically, if someone calls me a honky on the street, like for me, or for like a white person, it wouldn't be as insulting as if someone had.
The idea is the likelihood of that ever happening is slim.
True. Well, so I think this actually goes back to the first point that, okay, so if we're talking about the Western world where it's mostly dominated by European, Caucasian descent, so there's a lot of white people around, no one's hurling insults at the majority. Like it just doesn't happen, you know what I mean? Like and but I swear to you, if I go to Peru or something like that, everyone's calling me gringo and blah 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 blah. It comes back to that group dynamic.
But wait a minute,
If you're different from,
calling you a gringo isn't based on your race, is it? I thought that was based on
absolutely no, that's based on you being white. That's what they call white people. Really? Gringos. Yeah.
So an African American from the USA would never be called a gringo?
No, they would not call you a gringo.
Okay. I didn't know that. Because
they would maybe call you the other thing. I don't know. I think they have their own words.
There's a similar.
I'm sure they got words for you too.
Trust me, yeah. But I mean, it has different connotations, right? Like there's a similar word in Spain. They call people, British people, guiris, right? And it actually, I remember, because I had a Spanish roommate, and I asked him, who does this word refer to? And he says, you. Like people from the Netherlands, people from Germany, all people from Northern European countries, including the USA and Canada and Australia and New Zealand, who speak English with fluency, right?
Yeah.
So you're saying that the word gringo does not have the same connotations, right?
No, I'm saying
it refers to the color of your skin as well.
Exactly. I'm saying if you go to somewhere where a white person is the minority, they're going to have names that they might call you out and say, "Oh, look at that gringo," or whatever. Just as if it were to happen vice versa in the Western world. I think it happens a little less. I mean, that's a big speculative statement, but yeah, that's what I think happens. I think if you are in the minority, statistically speaking, you will be targeted far higher than if you're in the majority, racially speaking. And so to go to your point, if someone in England called me a honky or something, I would probably laugh and think that was hilarious because it's not insulting at all. But if you really are the minority and you already do feel left out and you do feel disconnected from the majority of society, then that insult's going to sting a lot more. You know what I mean?
Sure.
Because they're highlighting all those thoughts that you have already about your circumstance. So yeah, so I do think it'll sting a lot more because it's confirming all your isolation, your disconnect from the main tribe, so to speak.
Cool. Okay. So then you agree? Then you do believe that white people are less likely to experience that
in the Western world? Yeah.
Okay. In the Western world,
because white people are in the majority there.
Right. Okay. So the next one I find rather interesting, and again. Pertains to living in the Western world. So white people by and large can manifest unbridled pride about their own provenance or ancestry in public. I think that one clearly relate. Again, if you're living in India or China, I think people are gonna speak more proudly about their ancestry. I think I'm just imagining a situation where it includes people who are not white, right? So anyone
Well,
who doesn't derive from a white European country would feel somewhat disconcerted about talking about their provenance or ancestry in the West.
yeah,
So
yeah. So if we keep it into the West, yeah, I think that's right. I think as well, if you immigrate here or you're quite different, there is a bit of a um, natural inclination to adapt to your group and the group that you're in. I mean, we both know that you live in China, I live in England, and there's been probably adaptations on both of our parts to not stick out as much, even though for someone like me, I'm American, obviously I'm quite proud of where I come from and the country that I've been raised in and everything else. Even despite that, I've adapted to English society, to some of their cultural norms and their.
have you?
I've tried to stay strong, obviously, and not do that, but that's quite yeah. So for me, it's there is a bit of that. I think everyone tries to adapt to, and I think if you come from even more, obviously, I look like a lot of English people, probably a bit better looking, to be honest. But I'm joking. But I think I do fit in a lot more. So that adaptation was that pull to adapt. It was a lot
So do you believe
weaker
that?
for me than it would be for other people. Yeah.
Sure. So do you believe that English people, by and large, would be more receptive to your culture?
Yes.
And why?
Because I think
Okay.
it's more relatable.
Okay. So do you think that
It
English people would be more receptive to, let's say, an Eastern European country, like a Belarusian or Ukrainian? Do you think they'd be more
so
receptive to those kinds of people than people from outside of Europe?
So that's a really good example because obviously we're keeping this on racial
Right,
lines in
right.
Eastern Europe. Obviously they're very white. You see a Ukrainian, they're very white person. You know what I mean? However,
Ethnically, yeah.
the cultural differences there are quite stark. And I know for a fact, living in England for 7 years now, that Eastern Europeans, there is a negative stigma. There can be a negative stigma
Well,
attached to.
I think the negative stigma pertains to immigration, right? So I think it only really
Yes.
relates to those countries that um, consist of people who have immigrated to the UK. But I've lived in the UK all of my childhood, and I've never met a
Yeah.
Ukrainian or a Belarusian or Latvian or Lithuanian
But
living
you've met a
in the
Polish
UK.
person.
But I've
You've met a Polish
yeah,
person.
Polish, but that's a bit more central, right?
Yeah, but they're kind of Eastern European, and they're the ones maybe more specifically, because you do get Romanians,
Right.
Bulgarians, Polish people. I've had many experiences
But
with
but
them. I
but
mean,
just geographically speaking, Poland
mhm.
is just a bit more central than, let's say,
No,
Belarus or
but the
Ukraine.
but the point is that they're white predominantly,
Right.
and yet there still is a negative stigma attached to them, which basically I'm kind
Sure.
of
Okay.
breaking down
Okay.
the idea that is there white privilege? Well, not really. I think it's really based on your cultural value structures and things like that. And by the way, I love Polish people. I think they're awesome. They're obviously very, very hardworking, but
Hmm.
it is the negative stigma is based on like you said, immigration here, just like it would be in America for Mexicans. Mexicans, the stereotypes there that they work really hard and
But
they.
I think when you talk about people from these countries, it seems as though you're just relating to the stereotypes that people have of people from
Yeah,
those countries, right? Which always relates to immigration. So um, an
not
American,
always.
well, I think in the examples that you've given, they seem to relate to immigration. So Polish people, right? Again, diasporas of Polish people live in the UK. Same with
Hmm.
Romanians, right? So
Hmm.
I instantiated Ukraine and Belarus because I haven't ever met a Belarusian living in the UK. They probably exist, but they're probably not as predominant as Polish or Romanian. So they're ethnically white. But my question is, do you think that people would be more receptive to people from those countries whereby
because they're not in England
because
in large numbers.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%. In fact, I think if you're completely novel to someone in it, so for example, if you live in England and you have a ton of Polish people around you, you might develop a positive or negative stigma either way, and you start to form certain preconceived notions about whatever type of person, racial identity you're seeing all the time. Now, if you see someone just completely random, like a Ukrainian, you're like, I think that novelty will lend itself to curiosity rather than discrimination or stereotyping or anything like that.
With a white person, right? Is that what you're trying to say? So you,
well, I'm using your example as Ukrainian. Okay. So if I saw a Ukrainian and I never seen a Ukrainian before, I would be more pulled by curiosity than discrimination.
Okay, but I'm not asking you, right? I'm saying, do you think that more people in England, mostly white people or people who identify as white, do you think they would be more receptive to someone hailing from Belarus or someone hailing from fucking Tanzania or something in Africa?
I don't think so. I think England is a little different. Some of the European countries can be a lot different to somewhere like America, to be honest, where we don't get just because you guys are exposed to so many other cultures all the time. Right. So seeing someone from Tanzania or Belarus might not invoke such a strong response as it would in America, where we are very insular.
Yeah, I think America is a different ballgame. Right?
It's a different ballgame, yeah. So I think I don't think an English person would respond more negatively from someone from Tanzania versus Belarus based on the color of their skin. But that's my fairly ignorant opinion on that. So who knows? I mean, it completely depends on the person. I mean, if you go to somewhere, you go to some, what do they call the kind of the far right group in England, they're probably going to have a more negative response to someone from Tanzania.
I think they'll have a negative response to anyone. Right?
Well, exactly.
Anyone who's not British.
Exactly. So, yeah, that's probably. I mean, I could go to other places with that, but we'll stick.
Let's try to stick with the idea of privilege, right? Because I'm still not convinced that, by and large, white people aren't born with that, because the way that I would define a privilege is that most, if not all, people who identify as white or are perceived by the most of society as white should be able to exercise this privilege for it to constitute a privilege. And I do believe that. So I'm going to kind of go into the details in what I believe to be a privilege. I think that all people have privileges in society, and I believe that everyone should try to use their privilege to get as far as they can in society, right? It's like, I'm 5'10". I'd fucking love to be 6'1", right? And I do believe that if someone looked exactly like me, but was 2 or 3 inches taller than me, then I do believe that they have a privilege of being taller. Like I've asked girls and guys, and they've invariably said they prefer taller men, right? I don't think that the case would be the same with someone who, let's say, embodies the feminine role in a relationship, but almost invariably with men, it has been the case. And I just believe that if I were to show any sense of acrimony towards someone who was taller than me, because they have this privilege, I don't think it would be justified, right? So talking about privileges, I do believe that most, if not all, white people have some privileges, right? And I do believe that they
that
can.
other races don't.
Yes, like I do.
So okay, so and I think I know where you're going, because I think what you're saying kind of is that there's racial biases, and this is kind of what we've been skirting around quite a bit and talking about, is we do have racial biases
Right.
in the Western world towards certain races and ethnic groups. And so because of those biases we hold in our mind, those might afford more obstacles for the minority groups,
So
or
what
more
do you mean by
opportunities for the majority groups.
what do you mean by biases?
So for example, you know, if you are a typical ignorant American white boy and you've heard certain things from past generations about certain ethnic groups or something like that, you may attach a bunch of negative stigmas to a specific ethnic group. And then maybe eventually one day when you're a boss or a manager, you will discriminate against those ethnic groups on a personal level because
Ah,
of your personal biases, and that could afford certain privileges to
okay.
to the majority racial groups, whatever
Mhm.
you ally yourself with, and could afford or put potential obstacles in the way for the ethnic groups you don't ally yourself with. So I think that's kind of where privilege may seep into 21st century society, um, is through those personal biases that people may hold that are kind of a hangover from our past.
So you're saying that the privilege presupposes that the society is ignorant to whatever privilege it is that you're trying to utilize.
Well, what I'm saying is, if there is going to be privilege among racial groups
Yeah.
in Western society, it's going to be based on personal biases. It's not, it doesn't exist in our legislation, it doesn't exist in our government apparatus, but it does exist in individuals' minds and realities.
Mhm.
And that's where certain groups could be discriminated against, and certain groups could be afforded more opportunity than others because they have positive stigmas attached to their racial group as a whole, rather than negative stigmas attached to their racial group as a whole. Now, this is where we get into really abstract. This is where things really become not black and white. You know, we go into a real gray area here, obviously,
Yeah.
because how do you prove that? You know, how, and this is actually a really good point. This is a really good point in the conversation, actually, on this topic, because this is where, so for example, if we take engineers, for example, you look at the racial split between engineers and the racial split in the general populace as a whole. We'll use America. Say there's 13% African Americans, 12% Asian, whatever, in in America's populace. And for engineers, there's 2% African Americans and there's 40% Asians, and the rest are white. Now, if you were to just look at that, you could attribute many things to that, right? Depending on your personal experiences, you could say, well, look, you know, whites and Asians are much more privileged in engineering. They get offered more opportunities there.
Mhm.
They and that's a highly valued job, right? So you get paid quite a bit, and then you see the socioeconomic effects. You think, okay, they're making more money. They're more privileged than I am now. So there's that aspect, and then maybe there is a influence of personal bias there, where Asians and white people are hiring more of their own race unconsciously or consciously. Now, the other side of the coin, and this is where I think there's a much larger influence um, than personal biases, is those cultural value structures. So if an Asian person of Chinese descent is his family and his culture dictate that discipline, education, um, uh, delayed gratification, hard work is all highly valued in their society, and thus to put onto them in our capitalist society and in our framework, they're going to be more competitive for those engineering slots than if another culture didn't get those same value structures that the capitalist society values more, so, and we can get into this. I mean, this goes, I mean, we can go down a lot of rabbit holes. If there's a single parent household, you're going to have a lot more stress and anxiety in your family situation. With two parents, they're able to tag team situations and take breaks and detach and respond more appropriately to certain situations. If you're in a single parent household, you're a lot of times, you're doing everything and you're barely staying afloat, and you're doing that over a long period of time, and you're not so it could be harder to instill values that predicate success in a capitalist society, and sometimes those stereotypes and cultural values are more prevalent in certain racial groups than others, and that can afford a big discrepancy in socioeconomic situations that we see today. Now, do I think personal biases do have an influence there? Probably. Yeah, I think that's human nature. I think there is going to be some personal bias. I think if we were to look at the difference between socioeconomic situation between Asians and Africans, people of African descent, I think 80%, for example, would be more based on certain value structures in place there. And I think maybe 20 I think it's a lot more in the minority where personal bias influences that discrepancy that we see.
Okay, interesting. I think you raise a lot of good points there. I think that we could go like down many rabbit holes there. So
exactly.
I'm just gonna try and stick to the question: is there such thing as white privilege? Okay, so I've got some questions for you then. So again, kind of hoping for your complete honesty here. So do you think there are any shortcomings to being white in contemporary society?
Yeah, in contemporary society, I think there is starting to be more of a negative stigma attached to the white male in particular. But this is a very recent phenomenon. So this is in the last 5 years, I think, obviously, with the whole social justice warrior movements and things like that. The white male is being classed as the oppressor, and therefore maybe the something to not ally yourself with. They could be perceived as like the enemy. Now, I think this probably only happens in extreme situations, but we live in an increasingly polarized world. So I think as things polarize more, that stigma can proliferate more and create potential biases against white people. Yeah.
Do you see it as a form of revenge?
Absolutely. I think it's more of actually, I think it's more of a reaction to the overall economic situation. Wages aren't rising, income inequality is growing wider and wider, and people need a villain to kind of ascribe that to. And I think the white male, if you look at the list of billionaires in the world or whatever, 90% of it's white men, so boom, there you go. You got your classic profile of the person taking and hoarding all the money and opportunities to benefit themselves. I think this is where this type of discrimination, I guess you could say, is originating from my humble opinion.
Okay. So let's assume that you did believe that white privilege existed in any given Western society, do you think that it's okay, morally speaking, for a white person to use that privilege to gain a competitive advantage?
So if white people did have privileges in society I think so. I mean, that's a really tough one, right? You know, everyone, you want to do what's best for you and your immediate circle. And then once you do that, you want to help. If you can help other people. But I mean, if you have privileges afforded to you, why not take it? You know, if your parents do have a bit of money and you want to start a business, you have a socioeconomic privilege. You can get financing really easy, and for free in some cases. You know what I mean? Um, I don't think there's a moral downside to leveraging those privileges. Now
Okay.
it's a bit, yeah, that's a bit of a gray area though, a little bit. But I think personally, if you do have privileges afforded to you, for example, for affirmative action in America, you know, if a school needs a certain quota of a certain racial group, um, use that. You know, is that overall a good thing for society? That's another question. But I think if there are privileges afforded to you that will help benefit you and raise you and your immediate circle situation higher, then and well, so this is where we can get into like a little bit of a moral conundrum. If that opportunity and privilege allows you to move higher at the expense of someone else's ability to move higher with equal attribute and hard work, and you know,
Experience,
if all things,
conscientiousness, yeah.
exactly, if that's all equal and you're able to get ahead and they're not, then that's where you can get into a moral conundrum. But unfortunately, we kind of live in a bit of a dog eat dog competitive edge world. You know, some people win out, some people lose. You know,
Hmm.
um, that's nature sometimes. And is that immoral? It's hard to tell.
Yeah,
You
I
know.
think it's a question for another day. I think going into
Yeah.
the area
Yeah.
of
Exactly.
morality,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. Exactly. I agree. I agree.
indeed. Because the example that I was going to give is, um, well, I was first going to ask whether you thought it was okay for people to weaponize their privileges, right? So the best example is, you know, your quintessential Karen. I think it stems from America, right?
Hmm.
Her calling the police. I think there was an
Hmm.
instance. What was the?
Hmm.
I forget the name of the woman who called the police, who had a dog in the park, and she was talking to a
Hmm.
black guy, and she
Probably
was
Karen.
saying on yeah, she was saying on the phone that she was being harassed by a black guy at a public
Hmm.
park or something, right? Because
Yeah.
yeah, like if we talk about morality, I think that anyone would agree that that's not okay. Did she weaponize
Yeah.
her privilege there?
Yeah. Yeah.
Indeed, right?
No, I don't think that's okay, especially examples like that. I think, you know, especially in America, there is I think there is a bit of a stigma against African Americans
Yeah.
amongst the police force. Now there's a larger argument there, and there's a lot of factors to consider there, given crime rates and things like that, and statistically, all that type of stuff. But um, one thing that I will definitely put my hand up and say, you know, if I were to call the police on an African male, and say I kind of transgressed against him and he just reacted to me, and then I could call the police and get him in trouble, even though I'm the one that transgressed on him and he was just reacting. Statistically, I would probably get the upper hand in that situation from the perspective of the law. Now, that's where we get into personal bias,
Right.
privilege,
Yeah.
probably.
So it's predicated on the idea of the person or the people that you're interacting with being
Yeah.
as ignorant, right, as you,
Yeah.
or as you'd
Yeah.
hope
Yeah.
them to be.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, but then this is where we can get down into the layers of, on an individual basis, that could be really disheartening for, say, an African American who is getting ahead, studying, doing whatever he can do to be successful. And he has negative stigmas from the general uh, racial group that
I
he's
mean, if so,
attached to him,
if
then that would be very frustrating.
sure, but I
Given
mean,
that,
if that person has grown up in a Western country, they're probably acclimatized to it, right? So they're probably disabused by the idea of being treated like um, someone who predominates that given country, right? So the chance that they'll allow themselves to be put in a situation like that is a lot slimmer, right? I can say that I've done the same, right? I don't think that, I think I've gone out on nights with you before where I wouldn't engage in the same level of debauchery for the reasons
mm-hmm,
that if shit were to hit the fan, then
mm-hmm,
I could definitely be antagonized, right? So
yeah,
I think that even in that situation, I don't think that it could be an excuse for someone not to acquire success, right? I think that they should, if anyone, should know better than anyone that they shouldn't allow themselves to be subjected to such circumstances. So
yeah. And
yeah,
so, and it's quite interesting actually. That point is that maybe that puts um, someone with your ethnic background in better positions to be successful because you're not
right,
engaging in such debauchery,
right.
or because you can't. Now,
Mm.
that's unfortunate that you can't, be as wild and free without the risk, the greater risk of, you know,
Yeah,
enforcement
it's
or
the
things like
same
that.
here
That sucks, but
it's the same here living in China as well. I think the differences between a native Chinese person and any foreigner for that matter is so
yeah.
ostensible that we're warned frequently not to engage in behavior that could put us into that kind of danger. So I think that it,
Because you'll is that because you'll be disproportionately targeted by the police compared to the
yeah,
Chinese
well,
populace? Okay.
potentially, yeah, we'll be treated very differently.
Yeah. Yeah. And so and that's quite an interesting one, because I guess there would be a privilege there that the Chinese people can go a little more wild. They
Right.
have a lot more wiggle room when it comes to the laws that govern them.
I think just in
But
relativity to foreign people who make a ridiculous um, minority of the country. So
yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so, and a lot of this comes down to mindset as well, which comes down to your value structure and your habits, if because in the same situations, some foreigner in China could perceive that as their inability to get ahead, or they're being discriminated against, blah blah blah, and they use that as a reason why they can't get ahead. Then they're not going to get ahead, and that becomes their whole world becomes about the privileges and not privileges that they do or don't have, rather than someone who says, okay, I'm going to have to be a little more on the straight and narrow. That's not right, but
yeah, I think it's a completely different ballgame in China. I mean, they have their
yeah, yeah,
own sort of interplay with the idea of privilege. So yeah, I don't think that we're best off talking about the intricacies of that.
okay,
So yeah, let's just
hmm,
stick to the West, I think. Um,
hmm,
another question: do you think
yep,
that people are jealous of white people in the West?
probably. It comes back to what we were saying. If you're kind of the odd one out in the group, I'm sure you have thoughts that I wish I could just be part of the tribe, or I wish I could just be a part of, without being kind of discriminated against. I'm sure that that's there. It's probably more so for kids and things like that, where um, they don't have kind of society's mannerisms and things like that,
Right,
that is,
right.
and the civility that's kind of born into you as you get older. So that starts to take play, and you don't get discriminated as much, or you don't get isolated as much.
Yeah,
But
definitely.
I think as kids, for sure, 100%, I bet you most minorities probably think, oh, I wish, I was in this situation, or I wasn't different, like like I am, because they probably are being targeted for being different. And this is where, is that right or wrong? Or is that natural? I don't know. That's kind of a weird one. But yeah, I think there is probably jealousy there.
Interesting.
And it kind of lends itself to what you were saying before about being proud of your culture and heritage, right? If you're living in the Western world, you can be a lot more proud of your European heritage than someone else, unless you're like German or something. But if you're American or English, even now, I mean, that's kind of a weird question as well, because England, with their colonization and everything else, that's all of that's being torn down, and no one can really enjoy their heritage, because back in the day they had different value structures than we do now. And so should they all be demonized and everything else? I don't know. But yeah, bit of a tangent.
Okay. I was going to say that if it seems as though this new kind of postmodernist attitude stems on a kind of jealousy, right? That people, especially white people, are inclined to have some kind of competitive edge, whether it's socioeconomic or not. It seems as though, I mean, just thinking about an instance in which I would feel some kind of jealousy about somebody else, it always relates to the idea of having something that gives them a better chance to acquire something, right?
So when you were growing up in Manchester, did you have thoughts of jealousy for white English folk?
No, I didn't actually.
Okay.
I think it's interesting actually, because you kind of assumed that people would feel jealous as a child, right? But you're pretty ignorant as a child, right? So unless you truly understand the demographics of where you're living, you're not going to realize that until you actually live through it. So the difference between settling somewhere in a new country when you're an adult and settling into a new place when you're a kid is you seldom tend to check the demographics of where you're living. It depends on the school that you go to, right? The area that you live in, the people that you surround yourself by, and it's only then that you start to notice the cultural differences.
So where you grew up, did you grow up in a predominantly Black neighborhood then? Were you not?
I didn't actually know.
Okay.
Why did you assume that?
No, I'm just saying, if you did, maybe that you wouldn't have that sense of jealousy as much, because you're surrounded you are in the majority, you know what I mean? So you wouldn't have that sense of isolation. Or
it's pretty pluralistic where I'm from, right? So there are areas which are predominated by Black people, other areas like Africans or Caribbeans, other areas predominated by Muslims, other areas by white people. I think in my area, it was predominated by white people, but not far away, sort of pockets in society of Blacks or Muslims could be found as well. So people were pretty harmonious. I mean, people grew up knowing Muslims, Black Africans, Black Caribbeans. So people didn't tend to feel jealousy. They just noticed those cultural differences. And if you wanted to consort more with white people, it was an option. If you wanted to consort more with Black people, it was an option. So I actually had white friends. I actually had Black friends growing up. I also had Muslim friends, because the secondary school I went to was predominated by Muslims. So that's a lot of Pakistanis, Bangladeshi people. Like it wasn't really a problem for me.
Yeah, and that's quite an interesting point as well, because I think somewhere like New York City, or somewhere where there is a bit of a melting pot of a bunch of different cultures, I think the prevalence of something like white privilege or discrimination goes down quite a bit, given you are having so much interaction with other cultures. I think that ignorance, that personal bias that might proliferate, only happens it's on a lot more fertile soil when you're in a situation where it's predominantly one culture and they have very little
Right,
exposure
right,
to other
right.
cultures.
Yeah,
This is why you probably in the middle of villages in between England or Wales or somewhere like that, or in the South of America and Alabama or places like that, you get probably a lot more discrimination, and that's based on ignorance, right? You know,
yeah,
if
yeah,
you're not getting exposed to a lot of cultures, then you start creating your own stereotypes and your own interpretations rather than seeing them for yourself.
yeah. I think so. I think being a kind of second generation African kid, it was a lot easier, right? So I think a lot of the
Yeah,
hardship had already been endured in
yeah,
the community that I grew up in. So yeah, I think that definitely played um, a huge part.
yeah,
Okay, I want to kind of play the devil's advocate as well. So
yeah.
I think that you and I agree with, um, uh, let's say, most of the points that you've raised today.
Hmm.
But I'm guessing that some of the listeners might not agree. Um,
Yeah.
so let's say that white privilege did exist, and that
Hmm.
too many people, by and large, are weaponizing white privilege to get ahead in society, and that it was
Hmm.
immoral, and that we both agreed with that. Then,
Hmm.
what sort of things do you think that white people would have to do to dispense with their privileges? Obviously, the first question is it possible, right? And if so,
Yeah.
how would they go about doing that?
Yeah. I think that's an interesting question because I think if you have a privilege or you have a competitive advantage that allows you to uh, move higher socioeconomically relative to other ethnic groups, you're not going to give that up very easily, are you? And in fact, I think we would be a little remiss of human nature, or way too idealistic of human nature if we think that someone with an advantage would just willingly give that up um, on the basis of some kind of moral grounds, especially given that a majority of white people would have to do it as a group and simultaneously for it to work. You know, if just one person gave it up, then you're just basically putting yourself at a disadvantage.
Right.
So I think personally, I think, I know we're talking about 21st century, but I think, with the movement with Martin Luther King and things like that, that's what was required. I think if African Americans were silent, I think eventually, maybe eventually it could have been toppled. It had taken a lot longer, but I think um, the people who were disadvantaged systemically and through the legislation of the land, um, by doing peaceful protests and saying, "Hey, this isn't fair. We want opportunities just as you have, as white people have." Um, I think that made it constantly prevalent, and it kind of it, it 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 that was the catalyst that had changed America's legislation and Jim Crow laws and things like that. I think without that, it would have happened much more slowly and much more gradually, and it wouldn't have happened um, as it should have. I mean, look at South Africa as well. It took massive social movements. It took Nelson Mandela peacefully protesting and constantly showing the majority that this isn't fair. And that's human nature as well. I think genuinely we have a inclination for we have a very acute sense when things are unfair, and if you can play on that kind of shows that, hey, we are all humans at the end of the day, and there shouldn't be discrimination like this. But I think we'd be a little too idealistic to think that if a specific group has advantages that help them get ahead, that they would willingly put that down without any external catalysts as well. I just don't think it would
What
happen.
do you mean, put it down without an external catalyst?
So I think, for example, if white people did have a bunch of privileges, I don't think they would give that up on their own accord, basically, because morally it's wrong. You know, things are only morally wrong for someone if you're on the limited side of it. You know, if you're benefiting from it, that's really hard to give up, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, think of like a company or something. If they have some regulation that really this happens, you know, there's regulation that only big companies are allowed to, are able to deal with economically, and that puts small companies and startups at a disadvantage.
Yeah.
These large companies aren't going to be lobbying for the legislation to be a lot lighter for some of these smaller companies. In fact, they're doing the exact opposite. They're trying to exacerbate their privilege to maintain their position and grow it relative to the competition. And I think that would happen on a human individual level as well.
Yeah, I also think it's really, really tricky to kind of perceive your own privilege, right? I think it's so much easier to perceive the privilege that other
Exactly.
people are granted. And
Exactly.
I think this is what the
I
issue
agree.
is. I think that people are just looking up, right? They're obviously gauging their own milestone and then looking around them to see who's competing with them. And then kind of rather than taking responsibility, it's almost like they're passing the responsibility onto somebody else, on the competitor, the competitor as well, right? So they're expecting them to give up their advantage for them to have a better chance at acquiring whatever aspiration it is that they have, right? So it's something that I've noticed as well. Um, even I don't know how aware you are of this, but it's even prevalent in, I think, the African American community in Western countries, especially the USA. I think now that
Mm.
a few generations have gone by since the civil rights movement, we're starting to see
Mm-hmm.
a lot more Black people acquire success. And people
Mm-hmm.
expect them to kind of give up their, well, or follow some kind of political agenda, right? Which
Mm-hmm.
tends to lean on the left. And a
Mm-hmm.
lot of the Black people who have acquired their success seem to have different value structures than a lot of other African Americans who haven't acquired that yet. And
Mm-hmm.
people tend to antagonize those kinds of people who don't agree with the political agenda that they're putting forward. And it's just
Yeah.
so much more obvious in this generation, I think, that it is jealousy, right? That there can be, it's like,
Yeah.
unless you can get to the same level or the same social economic status, then of course it's easy for you to kind of vilify that individual, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think a lot of people are remiss in their duty to actually try and internalize whatever precepts they've used to get to where they are.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is where I think, you know, obviously the civil rights movement was insanely justified. There was the legislation in the land actually did discriminate and afford privileges
yeah.
on a
Mm,
systemic level.
mm,
So I think that was a very justified movement. But where something like this, I think, can get really dangerous, and just a whole expression of white privilege and things like that can get really dangerous as it starts to demotivate and disincentivize minority groups because they think the game's rigged towards
mm,
white people, or the games, and then they don't even start to put themselves forward, because why would you participate in a game that's rigged against you? That mentality can be very toxic and exacerbate the discrepancies we see in today's society, because unfortunately there is no equal idealistic kumbaya society where everyone's the same economic status. That's not how it works. Unfortunately, that's not how nature works. There's going to be people who do, society is going to value some things over others, and some people are going to be a lot better at providing that value than others, and they're going to get rewarded accordingly. And you know, that's just how it works, you know. And
yeah.
the more people use privilege as a crutch, or um, a reason to not even play the game are only going to be basically confirming they're going to be, it's going to be a positive feedback loop where they're going to materialize their own thoughts and things on the situation. And that's why I think the conversation around value structure should be way more prevalent. There's certain values that capitalist society it values more, which is, discipline, hard work, late gratification, education, these type of things. If you don't value those, you're not able to provide society itself with much value, and in return, you're not going to get rewarded accordingly, and your socioeconomic situation is going to stay stagnant or decline. And yeah, so I think it's this is where things have gotten a bit trickier in the 21st century, because I think we do genuinely live in a place where the best rise to the top, and those that don't want to try, or that don't, right, fall to the bottom. And I think that's how it should be. I think it should be a level playing field. All opportunities should be afforded to all players of the game. And some people are going to be better than others, but that's not based on their skin color or based on their ethnic heritage. That's based on their habits. That's based on their mindset. That's based on their value structure. If you value taking a bunch of drugs all the time, and something like that, then you get your outcome. That's completely on you. That's not the government's fault. That's not society's fault. You live in a free society where you have the freedom to move up or down the ladder as you choose. And it's not easy. It's not easy moving up the ladder either. So don't mistake privilege for hard work and discipline and education and investment in yourself, essentially.
Yeah, I think what we have to remind ourselves of as well, in pertinence to let's say Black America, or just Black people in the West in general, is that it's not that long ago, right, since Black people were granted the same privileges as white people, and to expect Black people to be competing at the same level of industriousness as white people in a culture that they have derived from for what, thousands of years. It's impossible, right? We're talking 1 or 2 generations, right?
No, I agree.
It's not been long at all. So if anything,
I agree.
It's us who should kind of take the reins and take responsibility and embody the kind of version of ourselves that we want to be, or versions of the people in society in our given ethnic group, to kind of take control of that and spearhead the way. Right?
I agree. I agree. I mean, it's about having a paradigm shift. It's about giving the rubric of success that maybe certain cultures have utilized for a long time, and sharing that and making that prolific in our education and popular culture. Otherwise, the same discrepancy.
I do sympathize with people who don't yet understand that, right? I think it can be quite contagious, this mindset, right? It can be something rather pernicious, right? The idea of kind of putting blame on somebody else, or excusing yourself for not having overcome something because of somebody else, right? I think it's so easy to fall victim to that. And I think that we do kind of have to try to understand that and think of more practical ways to promulgate the correct way to deal with these problems. Because me, for example, I didn't become cognizant of this kind of mindset until I actually graduated from university, right? So all throughout education, I kind of concede to having this kind of victim mentality, and and I admit it's so much easier to blame other people, especially when you're in a society that's predominated by the same ethnic group that oppressed your ancestors, or the majority of your ancestors, right? It's so easy
Yeah.
to fall to that. So that's me, and this is somebody who's grown up around
Uh,
white European people. So imagine if you haven't had the privilege of growing up and understanding people of another
yeah.
ethnic background, especially the ones who are kind of stigmatized as the oppressors, right?
Yeah. No, I completely agree with that. At the end of the day, it is a lot easier. It's a huge out for yourself. You can take all that personal responsibility off yourself, and you can kind of give yourself a pass, for any shortcoming or any um, you know, shortfall you've had in your life. You could say that wasn't me, it was this or that or that, and that's not conducive to success, unfortunately,
Mm.
regardless of your skin color or your circumstance. And I think the 21st century, I think certain minority groups definitely, it's very easy to justify their situation externally, and to give themselves that pass, um, because of it. It wasn't, like you said, it wasn't that long ago that, in the Americas is in the 60s, is even later in South Africa, and these um, cultural norms take a long time to filter out of society, you know what I mean? And that's still prevalent. But I think that's what's dangerous in the 21st century, is we're constantly keeping that alive, that mindset that gives you a pass at the end of the day to not do what you need to do to get ahead. And I know that might seem insensitive, but it's reality at
Yeah.
the end of the day.
Mm.
And unfortunately, we can't hide from truth based on the political correctness or political incorrectness that it might have. We're only going to become less effective as a people, and there's just going to create more turmoil among racial groups and things like that. I think, as like I said before, as long as everyone has the same opportunities, um, you know, let let the best rise to the top, and let's let's get our value structure right, and let competition and human nature do the rest. You know what I mean? But make it really well known what it takes to succeed. And a lot of that comes down to personal responsibility. That's really where it comes down to, investing in yourself, and um, not ignoring the external obstacles, but seeing external obstacles as just that, obstacles, not
Obstacles can be overcome,
barriers.
right? Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Exactly,
yeah.
exactly.
Mm.
Um, so yeah, and so I guess when we're coming back to it about white privilege in society, I think basically is what I'm saying is the very notion of it is very dangerous, given there is no legislation in the land that prevents other ethnic groups from getting ahead. There is no um, government apparatus ensuring white privileges over other ethnic groups. And so therefore there can be personal biases. I think we can all agree that we're all humans. Every person is racist in their own way. They see races, they might have stigmas against other races, whether they're positive or negative. Some people act on those way more than others. Some people who, um, that's just part of it, and that, hopefully, this is the one positive this is one of the positive aspects, I think, maybe, of the recent movements in the last 5 or 6 years, is that people are becoming more aware of that. Um, but I think that awareness is good. It shouldn't go any farther than that, I don't think, because we could start to popularize excuses for people to not get ahead because they think the whole system's rigged against them, which it's not. There could be personal biases and things like that, and those are some of the external obstacles that we have to overcome. And if you are an ethnic minority group, that's a good way to make change as well, is become productive, become, self-actualizing all the goals that you want to do, And
Yeah, I mean, I think
yeah, let your life be the example of,
right,
you know,
right.
what can be possible regardless of your skin
I
color.
think if everyone presupposed that everyone is suffering to some degree, like if everyone presupposed that life is suffering, then
Hmm.
everyone would sympathize with another person. The kind of suffering they
Yep.
might be subjected to, it could be obviously different. But
Yeah.
I think now more and more people, especially in progressive countries, are learning to understand that um, suffering or hardship is ineluctable. It's inevitable,
It's universal.
right?
Yeah.
It's universal,
Yeah.
right? And it's not necessarily the the idea of suffering that should prevail, but it's the way that you approach it, right?
Exactly. And I think that's a really good point, is no matter your skin color, um, no one escapes suffering. You may think that someone in a higher socioeconomic situation is living some fairy tale life, or this celebrity or that celebrity's living some dream life, and because, you know, because they have money or
Right.
fame
Yeah.
or whatever, that's ignorance. That's complete ignorance. No
And
one escapes suffering.
it's
And
just so easy to perceive your own suffering or suffering
exactly.
within your own small circle, right? And
Exactly.
usually people will claim that it pales in comparison to the suffering experienced by someone higher in a higher socioeconomic position, right? So I think
Exactly.
this is a reason why it permeates society, is because
Hmm.
as long as somebody from the same sort of um, economic background agrees, right, you can kind of march towards the same anger and the same kind of blame um, directing to a specific group in society, right? And I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
that that's why a lot of white people in the West who share the same social economic status, who are competing alongside
Hmm.
ethnic
Hmm.
minorities, feel
Hmm.
victimized, right? They feel
Hmm. Hmm.
silenced, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
And we
Yeah, because their suffering isn't justified. Like the
exactly,
exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's dangerous.
And exactly. And I think that that's a great idea to spread. I know it sounds crazy, but to say that, hey, suffering is universal. No one escapes it. And when you see that, you know, you don't get that. It's a lot easier to take responsibility for your situation in life. Like, look,
Mm,
everyone's going through their own thing
mm,
in all kinds of different shapes and colors. These are mine. These are my sufferings. This is for me to handle. And when you can start to see past your own suffering, then you're able to detach from some of the issues in your life and be a lot more effective. And, you know, yeah, take advantage
yeah.
of some of these privileges that there is out there. You know,
Yeah, it's
so
funny.
yeah.
Even my brother and I, who are identical twins, right?
Hmm.
We've had arguments about the privileges that I think it's quite palpable. I mean, I'm a homosexual and he's a heterosexual, so
Hmm.
we've had arguments about the privileges that I believe he's had, and the privileges
Mm,
he believed that
mm,
I have, and we both share the same parents, right? So
yeah.
again, it kind of substantiates the idea that it's so much easier to perceive the privileges that somebody else is
Hmm.
enjoying than
Hmm.
to
Yeah,
perceive the privileges that you're enjoying yourself, right? And
exactly.
just imagine that nobody kind of understands the perspicuity behind that, then it's so easy
Yeah.
to become susceptible to some kind of ideology, right? That
Hmm.
justifies your suffering.
Yeah,
It's
of
fascinating.
course. And if you think about it, I mean, you're incentivized to conveniently kind of forget or
Mm,
ignore your own privileges and to point out the ones that are going against you. You
yeah.
know, that's just typical evolution, right? You want to increase the things that are helping you get ahead and decrease the things that are holding you
Yeah.
back. You know what I mean?
Mm,
So it's kind of hardwired in your brain. So that's why people who do experience privileges aren't going to see them as much, or and purposefully so, potentially. You know what I mean? That's not their focus. Their focus is going to be the things that are holding them back, rather than the things that moving them forward, because those are the problems, right? Those are the perceived problems, and those are what's going to take your attention, other than the things that are helping you get ahead. You know what I mean? um, so yeah, and that's where I was kind of going back to the point where, if white privilege did persist in today's society on a big scale, white people aren't going to be the ones to voluntarily give that up. That's why you needed the
Yeah.
civil rights movement or something like that, because we're all human. We understand unfairness, and if you touch that human nature side that spans across all races on unfairness, then you get change. You get what the civil rights movement accomplished. Um, but yeah, but at a certain extent, we got to be careful with that, because there isn't that same token, that can be a dangerous mindset as well. But
Interesting.
yeah.
I have to admit, like, you did surprise me. I didn't. I
Mm-hmm.
actually thought you would believe that white privilege exists. So this actually took an interesting turn. I think I
Mm-hmm.
wasn't prepared for some of the arguments you put forward, but you've definitely swayed me in to kind
Mm-hmm.
of agree with you. Because even when I was composing the list, I
Mm-hmm.
after when I finished writing down every single privilege that I believe that white people had, especially
Mm-hmm.
living in China, it's became so palpable that these privileges are only enjoyed because it's predominated by that specific ethnicity and culture, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the idea of a privilege only existing in relativity to somebody else's ignorance is also an interesting aspect as well. So, like
Mm-hmm.
the example that we gave before about the woman calling the police, she's assuming that the police officer she's speaking to is an ignorant dick, right? And if they
Yeah.
aren't, they'll be like, so fucking what? It's a black person, right? What is he doing
Mm-hmm.
to you, right? Which would be
Mm-hmm.
the normal sort of way to respond to such a circumstance. So, yeah,
Yeah.
it's interesting.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, I completely agree that privilege did persist throughout history. And I think in the Western world, we've done really well to eradicate most of that on a government systemic scale, and eradicate that from our legislation and things like that. Um, and that brings us into a new era where hopefully the conversation starts to shift towards what attributes, what values do we want in society,
Mm.
and reward those appropriately. You know what I mean? And that spans across all races, all people. And hopefully we can start to move the conversation to that aspect more than just what our skin color is, and what stereotypes and stigmas are attached to that. And I think that's constantly changing. I think
Yeah,
we're
yeah.
getting
I think
success.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Mm. I think that's,
Exactly.
yeah, I think it's already shaking up society, right? Like, I think
Mm-hmm.
people have become integrated into these Western societies, and
Mm-hmm.
the more integrated they become, the more familiarized people become with these kind of disparate cultures, right? Integrating into their communities, the less competitive edge somebody is going to have that's predicated on a bias, right?
Exactly. And think about it, dude. We were coming out of a world, 500 years ago to 100 years ago, where everything was insanely segregated. Everyone
Mm.
was separated by language, by insane cultural practices. Everything was completely separated by your culture, your language, your heritage, your race, everything. And obviously, in the Western world, we've started to mold everything together. And now we live in a world with Netflix, with YouTube. Everyone's watching the same shows. Everyone's being exposed to the same cultural,
Mm.
the same news, the same, all this other stuff. And that's
Yeah,
starting to break down
yeah.
this kind of
It's
tribalistic.
almost
um,
becoming impossible to be ignorant, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it's kind of funny though, because everything kind of has a polarizing effect sometimes. I think this whole melting pot that we've put ourselves in, which is a good thing in my perspective, because it takes the emphasis off these race and all these other things and puts it more on things that actually matter, which is your values and things like that. But I think that's where we're kind of seeing these far right political movements show up. We're seeing certain things pop up as a response to this melting pot position as well. And I guess that's the dichotomy with everything. But yeah, I think though that we're still moving, we're still progressing, we're still evolving, and I think the last 5-6 years with the political happenings that we had and things like that, people could think that we were taking steps backwards. But I think, these tumultuous periods are actually periods of transformation. And I think that's what's happening, to be honest. So hopefully it continues that way. But we'll see. We're definitely living in wild times, and times where I think something like white privilege or the concept of races having other privilege is a lot is fairly abstract now. It's down to personal bias and human nature, where before it was a lot more prevalent fixture in society. I think that's kind of gone now. And there are issues facing all races that we need to focus on. And that could be income inequality. That can be other things that impacts everyone. And hopefully that's where our focus goes to moving forward.
Cool. Good stuff.
Yeah.
So if that's all, I guess we can finish up our first episode there. So for those of you listening, I hope you've enjoyed our first podcast. There'll definitely be more content coming your way, so stay tuned. Yeah, so I hope you guys enjoyed it.
Yeah, definitely. And just to let you guys know, as we will be touching on a lot of controversial topics. So, we're not trying to put any position on these things. We're just kind of talking it through our own life experiences. So I think a lot of these things are swept under the carpet or not spoken about openly. So hopefully we can change that with some of these conversations we have.
Sweet.
Cool. Thanks, everyone.